The day started like any other for Marcus Thompson, a man known for his calm demeanor and unwavering dedication to justice. As the U.S. Attorney General, he had spent years fighting for fairness in the legal system, but today, he wasn't thinking about policies or courtrooms across the nation. Instead, his mind was focused on something much closer to his heart, his 16-year-old daughter, Layla. She was an intelligent, kind-hearted teenager who loved painting, reading poetry, and occasionally teasing her dad about how out of touch he was with modern music. But this morning there was no teasing or laughter. Layla looked nervous as they pulled into the parking lot of the small county courthouse. Layla's visit to the courthouse wasn't because of anything serious, at least not in Marcus's eyes. A few weeks earlier, she'd been pulled over by a police officer for failing to come to a complete stop at a stop sign. It was her first traffic violation, and while Marcus knew it was part of growing up, he also understood that moments like these could feel overwhelming for young people, especially those from marginalized communities. He remembered all too well the feeling of being watched differently, judged before even opening your mouth. That was why he insisted on coming along, not just as her father, but as someone who wanted to make sure the process felt fair. As they walked through the heavy, wooden doors of the courthouse, Marcus noticed the way some heads turned when they entered. People whispered, glancing at them curiously. Layla kept her gaze fixed on the floor, clutching the strap of her bag tightly. "You'll be fine," Marcus reassured her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Just tell the truth, and everything will work out." Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Rows of uncomfortable chairs lined the walls, occupied by people waiting their turn to face the judge. Some looked anxious, others seemed resigned. At the front of the room sat Judge Evelyn Harper, a woman infamous in local circles for her strict rulings and short temper. Even seasoned attorneys approached her bench with caution, knowing one wrong move could lead to scathing rebukes. When Layla's name was called, she stood hesitantly, looking back at Marcus for reassurance. He gave her a small nod, silently promising to stay by her side throughout the proceedings. They approached the podium together, and Layla began explaining what had happened on the day of the traffic stop. Her voice trembled slightly as she recounted the details. She'd slowed down at the intersection, thought she'd stopped fully, and realized only later that she might have missed it by a fraction of a second. But Judge Harper didn't seem interested in hearing excuses. From the moment Layla started speaking, the judge's expression hardened. Her sharp eyes narrowed behind her glasses, and her lips pressed into a thin line. When Layla stumbled over her words, trying to clarify her point, Judge Harper interrupted, sharply. "Young lady, do you understand the rules of the road?" she barked, leaning forward in her chair. Caught off guard, Layla hesitated. "Yes, ma'am." "I mean mostly," she stammered, her confidence wavering under the weight of the judge's piercing stare. The pause lasted only a second, but it felt like an eternity. In that brief silence, something inside Judge Harper snapped. Without warning, she rose slightly from her seat, reached across the bench, and slapped Layla hard across the face. The sound echoed through the otherwise quiet courtroom, leaving everyone stunned. Gasps rippled through the rows of spectators, and several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Layla staggered backward, her hand flying to her cheek as tears welled up in her eyes. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. No one moved. No one spoke. All eyes were glued to the scene unfolding before them. Marcus felt as though the air had been knocked out of him. His stomach churned with anger, and his fists clenched involuntarily at his sides. Every instinct screamed at him to step forward, to demand answers, to protect his child. Yet he forced himself to remain still, taking a deep breath to steady his racing thoughts. This wasn't just about him or Layla anymore. It was bigger than that. What happened here mattered not only to his family, but to countless others who faced similar injustices every day. For Layla, the world tilted sideways. Pain radiated from her cheek, but it was nothing compared to the humiliation and confusion washing over her. Why had the judge done that? Wasn't this supposed to be a place where fairness ruled? She turned toward her father, seeking comfort, but what she saw in his eyes made her hesitate. There was fury there, yes, but also something else. A steely resolve that told her things were far from over. In the seconds that followed, Marcus realized he had a choice to make. He could reveal his identity right then and there, using his authority to put an immediate end to the situation. Or he could take a different approach, one that might allow him to address the larger issues at play without escalating tensions further. Either way, he knew this moment would define more than just his relationship with his daughter. It would shape the future of how justice was served in places like this courtroom. And so, with deliberate calmness, Marcus stood up. His towering frame commanded attention, and the room fell silent as all eyes turned to him. He didn't raise his voice or let his emotions get the better of him. Instead, he spoke slowly and clearly, addressing Judge Harper directly. "Your Honor," he said, his tone firm but measured, "may we please have a recess? There are matters here that require clarification." It was a simple request, yet it carried the weight of someone accustomed to demanding respect. Judge Harper blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. For the first time since the slap, uncertainty flickered across her face. Whatever she had expected from this man, it wasn't this. A composed, authoritative presence that hinted at something far greater, lurking beneath the surface. Little did she know the real storm was yet to come. The courtroom remained eerily silent as Marcus stood tall, his commanding presence drawing all eyes toward him. Judge Harper, still reeling from the unexpected challenge to her authority, stared at him with a mix of confusion and irritation. For a fleeting moment, she seemed unsure how to respond. Her usual confidence wavered under the weight of Marcus's calm but unyielding demeanor. After what felt like an eternity, she gave a curt nod, agreeing to a recess without offering any explanation or apology. As the bailiff ushered them into a private chamber adjacent to the courtroom, Layla clung to her father's arm, her body trembling with a mix of fear and disbelief. Her cheek was still red from the slap, and tears streamed silently down her face. Marcus wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close in a protective embrace. "You're safe now," he whispered, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "I promise you, this won't go unanswered." Once they were alone in the chamber, Marcus turned his attention back to Judge Harper, who entered moments later flanked by 2 court officers. She looked flustered, her earlier bravado replaced by a palpable unease. Before she could say anything, Marcus stepped forward, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. "Your Honor," he began, his tone measured but firm. "Before we proceed further, I need to clarify something important. My name is Marcus Thompson. I am the United States Attorney General." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Judge Harper froze mid-step, her jaw dropping slightly as the gravity of the situation sank in. The color drained from her face, and for a brief second it seemed as though she might collapse. Behind her, the court officers exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to do next. No one had anticipated that the man standing before them, a man whose quiet strength had already unsettled them, was one of the most powerful figures in the country's legal system. Judge Harper stammered, trying to regain her composure. Mr. Attorney General, I assure you this is not what it seems," she said, her voice cracking under the pressure. It was a momentary lapse in judgment. The young lady appeared disrespectful, and I reacted poorly. I deeply regret my actions. Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied her carefully, letting the weight of her words and her guilt hang in the air. He knew that apologies wouldn't undo what had happened to Layla, nor would they erase the years of systemic injustice that allowed such behavior to persist unchecked. But he also understood that this moment presented a rare opportunity, a chance to hold someone accountable while shining a light on the deeper issues plaguing the justice system. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice cutting through, the tension like a knife. "Your Honor," he said, "what occurred in that courtroom today was unacceptable, not just because it involved my daughter, but because it reflects a broader pattern of abuse and disregard for the rights of individuals, particularly those from marginalized communities. You may view this as a momentary lapse one, but for countless others, these kinds of incidents are far too common. They leave scars that last a lifetime. He paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. I will not tolerate such conduct, especially within the walls of a courthouse, a place meant to uphold justice, not undermine it. As U.S. Attorney General, I have a responsibility to ensure that our legal system operates fairly and equitably for everyone, and I intend to fulfill that duty here and now. Layla watched her father with a mixture of awe and pride. Despite everything she'd been through, seeing him take control of the situation filled her with a sense of security she hadn't felt since entering the courthouse. She wiped away her tears, straightening her posture as if drawing strength from his unwavering resolve. Meanwhile, Judge Harper struggled to find the right words. She shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with both Marcus and Layla. Please, Mr. Attorney General, she pleaded, desperation creeping into her voice. I beg you to consider the context. I've been under immense stress lately, juggling caseloads and personal challenges. This isn't who I am. I swear it. Marcus listened patiently, his expression unreadable. While he sympathized with the pressures faced by judges and other public servants, he couldn't ignore the fact that those pressures didn't excuse harmful behavior. Stress does not justify violence or misconduct, he replied evenly. If anything, it highlights the need for better support systems and accountability measures within our judicial institutions. But that conversation can wait until after we address what happened today. With that, Marcus outlined his immediate demands. First, he insisted on an independent investigation into the incident, conducted by federal authorities outside the jurisdiction of the county courthouse. Second, he called for Judge Harper's temporary suspension pending the outcome of the inquiry. Finally, he requested that Layla's case be dismissed outright, citing the clear bias and inappropriate conduct displayed during the hearing. To her credit, Judge Harper didn't argue. She nodded weakly, agreeing to comply with each of Marcus's requests. But even as she did so, she couldn't shake the feeling that her career, and perhaps her reputation, was hanging by a thread. As the meeting drew to a close, she offered another apology, this time directed at Layla. Miss Thompson, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, I am truly sorry for what I did. It was wrong, and I will do everything in my power to make amends. Layla hesitated, unsure whether to accept the apology. Part of her wanted to lash out to express the anger and humiliation she'd felt when the judge struck her, but another part, the part influenced by her father's example, knew that forgiveness wasn't about excusing bad behavior. It was about choosing peace over bitterness. Slowly, she nodded, acknowledging the apology without saying a word, as they left the chamber and returned to the main courtroom. Whispers erupted among the spectators. Word of Marcus's identity had spread quickly, thanks to the court officers who couldn't resist sharing the dramatic twist with their colleagues. By the time Marcus and Layla exited the building, reporters had gathered outside, cameras flashing, and microphones thrust forward in hopes of capturing a statement. Marcus ignored them, guiding Layla gently toward their car. On the drive home, neither of them spoke much. Layla stared out the window, lost in thought, while Marcus gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing with plans for the days ahead. He knew the road to justice wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that moments like these, moments that exposed flaws in the system, were opportunities to create lasting change. And for the first time since stepping foot in the courthouse, Marcus felt a glimmer of hope. Hope that together they could turn pain into purpose and transform a single act of injustice into a movement for reform. The days following the courthouse incident were a whirlwind of activity, both for Marcus Thompson and the nation at large. News of what had transpired spread like wildfire, fueled by social media posts, eyewitness accounts, and the relentless pursuit of journalists eager to uncover every detail. Within hours, video clips surfaced, captured discreetly by courtroom attendees on their phones, that showed Judge Harper slapping Layla across the face. The footage was grainy but undeniable, sparking outrage across the country. Marcus found himself thrust into the spotlight in ways he hadn't anticipated. While he'd always been a public figure as the U.S. Attorney General, his role had typically kept him behind the scenes, shaping policies and advocating for systemic change from within. But now, his personal life had collided with his professional responsibilities in a way that left no room for retreat. Every news outlet wanted a statement, every talk show invited him for an interview, and every activist group sought his endorsement. Yet, despite the overwhelming attention, Marcus remained focused on one thing: ensuring justice for Layla and for others who might find themselves in similar situations. At home, the atmosphere was tense but loving. Layla, still processing the trauma of the slap, spent much of her time in quiet reflection. She alternated between moments of anger, sadness, and confusion, often retreating to her room to write in her journal or sketch in her notebook. Her art became a form of therapy, allowing her to express emotions she struggled to put into words. Marcus checked on her frequently, making sure she felt supported while giving her space to heal. He encouraged her to share her feelings but never pressured her, knowing that healing would take time. Meanwhile, Marcus worked tirelessly behind the scenes to address the fallout. He coordinated with federal investigators to ensure the inquiry into Judge Harper's actions was thorough and impartial. He also reached out to civil rights organizations, community leaders, and legal experts to discuss how the incident could serve as a catalyst for broader reforms. Together, they drafted proposals aimed at increasing accountability in courtrooms, improving training for judges and law enforcement officers, and creating safer environments for young people navigating the legal system. But it wasn't just Marcus's efforts that captured the public's attention. It was the groundswell of support from ordinary citizens. Protesters gathered outside courthouses nationwide, holding signs that read, "Justice for Layla," and "No more abuse of power." Social media campaigns amplified their voices, with hashtags like "Fair Courts for All" trending for days. Stories poured in from individuals who had experienced similar mistreatment at the hands of authority figures, many of whom had never spoken out before. What started as a single act of misconduct had ignited a national conversation about fairness, respect, and the need for systemic reform. Amidst the chaos, Judge Harper became a lightning rod for criticism. Once respected, if not feared for her strict adherence to the rules, she was now vilified as a symbol of judicial overreach and unchecked privilege. Calls for her removal from the bench grew louder, and petitions demanding her resignation garnered hundreds of thousands of signatures. Legal ethics boards launched formal investigations into her conduct, examining not only the incident involving Layla but also past cases where defendants claimed they had been treated unfairly. For Judge Harper, the scrutiny was unbearable. She went into seclusion, avoiding interviews and public appearances. Rumors swirled about her mental state, with some speculating that the stress of the situation had pushed her to the brink. Yet, even as sympathy for her plight emerged in certain circles, the majority of the public remained steadfast in their condemnation. To them, her actions represented everything wrong with a system that allowed those in power to act with impunity. Back at the Thompson household, Marcus tried to shield Layla from the worst of the media frenzy. He turned off the television whenever sensationalized reports aired and monitored her phone to prevent trolls from contacting her. Still, it was impossible to completely insulate her from the storm. Friends texted her screenshots of memes featuring her name, classmates whispered about her at school, and strangers approached her family in public places, offering condolences or asking invasive questions. At times, Layla felt like she was living in a fishbowl, her every move scrutinized by people she didn't know. Despite the challenges, there were moments of light amidst the darkness. Support poured in from unexpected places. Teachers sent encouraging notes. Neighbors dropped off homemade meals, and even distant relatives reached out to offer kind words. One particularly touching gesture came from a local artist who painted a mural dedicated to Layla, depicting her standing tall against a backdrop of scales and gavels. Beneath the image were the words, "Courage inspires change," a reminder that her story had touched hearts far beyond her hometown. As weeks turned into months, the investigation into Judge Harper's actions progressed steadily. Federal agents interviewed witnesses, reviewed court records, and analyzed the viral videos frame by frame. Their findings painted a damning picture. Judge Harper had a history of volatile behavior, including documented complaints from attorneys and defendants alike. While none of these incidents had resulted in disciplinary action, they collectively suggested a pattern of misconduct that could no longer be ignored. Public pressure mounted as details emerged, forcing judicial oversight committees to act swiftly. In a landmark decision, Judge Harper was permanently removed from the bench, a rare occurrence in the world of judiciary accountability. Criminal charges were also filed against her for assault, marking one of the first times a sitting judge faced such consequences for actions taken during official proceedings. For Marcus, the outcome was bittersweet. On one hand, he felt a sense of vindication knowing that justice had been served, not just for Layla, but for everyone affected by Judge Harper's behavior. On the other hand, he couldn't help but reflect on the deeper issues exposed by the case. How many other judges, police officers, or authority figures abused their power without consequence? How many young people walked away from courtrooms feeling humiliated, disrespected, or dehumanized? These thoughts weighed heavily on Marcus as he prepared to deliver a speech at a national summit on criminal justice reform. Standing before a packed auditorium filled with policymakers, activists, and survivors of injustice, he spoke candidly about the day everything changed. What happened to my daughter should never happen to any child. Not in a courtroom. Not anywhere, he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. It's easy to focus on the individual responsible, to demand punishment and move on. But true justice requires more than that. It demands we confront the systems that enable such abuses to occur in the first place. His words resonated deeply with the audience, earning thunderous applause. For many, Marcus's speech crystallized the importance of addressing root causes rather than merely treating symptoms. It inspired renewed calls for legislation aimed at increasing transparency in courtrooms, mandating implicit bias training for all legal professionals, and establishing independent oversight bodies to handle complaints of misconduct. As the summit concluded, Marcus returned home to find Layla waiting for him. She looked different somehow, stronger, more self-assured. Over dinner, she shared that she'd decided to channel her experience into something positive. Inspired by the mural dedicated to her courage, she planned to start a youth advocacy group focused on empowering teenagers to speak up against injustice. I don't want anyone else to feel the way I did that day, she told him earnestly. If telling my story helps even one person stand up for themselves, then maybe this whole thing won't have been for nothing. Marcus smiled, pride swelling in his chest. Through pain and adversity, his daughter had discovered her voice and her purpose. Together they had turned a moment of injustice into a movement for change, proving that even in the darkest times, hope and resilience could shine through. The months following Judge Harper's removal from the bench marked a turning point, not just for Marcus and Layla Thompson, but for communities across the nation. The case had ignited a firestorm of discussions about accountability, fairness, and the need for systemic reform in the justice system. What began as a deeply personal ordeal for the Thompson family quickly evolved into a nationwide movement, with people from all walks of life rallying behind the call for change. For Layla, the aftermath of the incident was a journey of healing and empowerment. At first, she struggled to reconcile her feelings about what had happened. On one hand, she was relieved that Judge Harper had been held accountable. On the other, she couldn't shake the lingering sense of vulnerability that came from being publicly humiliated in such a profound way. Nights were often restless, filled with dreams where she relived the moment of the slap. During the day, she found herself hyper-aware of how others perceived her, as the girl whose story had gone viral. But over time, something shifted inside her. Encouraged by her father's unwavering support and inspired by the outpouring of solidarity from strangers, Layla began to see her experience not as a source of shame, but as an opportunity to make a difference. She threw herself into planning the youth advocacy group she'd mentioned during their dinner conversation. With Marcus's help, she connected with mentors, activists, lawyers, and educators who guided her through the process of building an organization from scratch. Layla named the group Courage Speaks, drawing inspiration from the mural that had celebrated her resilience. The mission was simple yet powerful: to provide young people with tools, resources, and platforms to advocate for themselves when navigating legal systems or facing discrimination. Through workshops, storytelling sessions, and partnerships with schools and community centers, Courage Speaks aim to amplify voices that might otherwise go unheard. As word spread about Layla's initiative, invitations began pouring in for her to speak at events. Initially hesitant to step into the spotlight again, she eventually agreed to share her story at a local town hall meeting. Standing before a crowd of parents, teachers, and students, Layla spoke candidly about the fear and pain she'd felt after the courtroom incident, and how those emotions had fueled her determination to create change. Her speech moved many in the audience to tears, and afterward dozens of teenagers approached her to thank her for speaking up. For the first time since the incident, Layla felt a sense of purpose stronger than her fear. While Layla focused on grassroots efforts, Marcus channeled his energy into policy reform at the federal level. As U.S. Attorney General, he used his position to push for sweeping changes designed to prevent similar abuses of power in the future. One of his top priorities was introducing legislation requiring mandatory sensitivity training for judges, court staff, and law enforcement officers. He argued that understanding implicit biases and learning de-escalation techniques were essential skills for anyone working within the justice system. Marcus also championed the creation of independent oversight boards tasked with investigating complaints of misconduct. These boards would operate outside the influence of local governments, ensuring impartiality and transparency. Additionally, he advocated for stricter guidelines regarding interactions between judges and minors, emphasizing the importance of treating young defendants with dignity and respect. To build momentum for these proposals, Marcus embarked on a national tour, visiting cities and towns to meet with community leaders, listen to citizens' concerns, and gather input for the reforms. At each stop, he shared Layla's story, not to garner sympathy, but to illustrate the real-world impact of failing to hold authority figures accountable. His approach resonated deeply with audiences who appreciated his authenticity and commitment to meaningful change. Of course, not everyone supported Marcus's efforts. Critics accused him of using his daughter's trauma for political gain, while others dismissed his proposals as unnecessary bureaucracy. Some judges and attorneys bristled at the idea of increased oversight, arguing that it undermined judicial independence. But Marcus remained undeterred, reminding skeptics that accountability and integrity went hand in hand. A system that values fairness above all else is not a threat to justice, he said during a televised debate. It is its foundation. Meanwhile, the media continued to play a significant role in shaping public perception of the case. Documentaries, podcasts, and investigative reports explored the broader implications of Judge Harper's actions, highlighting patterns of misconduct in courthouses across the country. One particularly impactful series featured interviews with individuals who had endured similar mistreatment, shedding light on the emotional toll of encountering bias and hostility within the legal system. The series ended with a poignant message. Justice begins with respect and ends when respect is denied. As the months passed, the ripple effects of Layla's courage became increasingly evident. Schools incorporated lessons about civic responsibility and advocacy into their curriculums, inspired by Courage Speaks. Law schools added courses on ethical decision-making and cultural competency, reflecting the growing demand for reform-minded professionals. Even social media played a part, with hashtags like #Respect in Courts and Youth Voices Matter trending regularly, keeping the conversation alive. Judge Harper's trial added another layer of complexity to the unfolding narrative. Prosecutors presented evidence showing not only the slap itself, but also a pattern of aggressive behavior throughout her career. Defense attorneys countered by portraying her as a victim of stress and burnout, arguing that she deserved leniency rather than punishment. The trial captivated the nation, with millions tuning in to watch the proceedings unfold. When the verdict was finally announced, it sent shockwaves through the legal community. Judge Harper was found guilty of misdemeanor assault and sentenced to probation, along with mandatory anger management classes and community service. While some viewed the sentence as too lenient, Others saw it as a balanced response that acknowledged wrongdoing without ruining her life entirely. Either way, the trial served as a stark reminder of the consequences of abusing power, a lesson that resonated far beyond the courtroom. Through it all, Marcus and Layla remained steadfast in their mission. They attended rallies together, participated in panel discussions, and worked tirelessly to keep the momentum going. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day, forged not just by shared hardship, but by a shared vision for a better future. Though the road ahead was long, they faced it with hope and determination, knowing that every small victory brought them closer to lasting change. And so, what had started as a single act of injustice, a slap delivered in anger, became a catalyst for transformation. It reminded the world that even in the face of adversity, courage could inspire action, and action could lead to progress. For Marcus and Layla, the fight was far from over, but they walked forward hand in hand, ready to tackle whatever challenges lay ahead. The final chapter of Marcus and Layla Thompson's journey unfolded not with a dramatic courtroom verdict or a sweeping legislative victory, but with quiet, steady progress, a testament to the power of persistence and collective action. Months had passed since Judge Harper's sentencing, and while the headlines about her case had faded from the front pages, the impact of the reforms inspired by Layla's story continued to ripple outward, reshaping systems and touching lives in ways no one could have predicted. For Layla, the transformation was profound. What began as a deeply personal wound had blossomed into a source of strength and purpose. Her advocacy group, Courage Speaks, had grown far beyond its humble beginnings. What started as a small initiative run out of her family's living room now boasted partnerships with schools, community organizations, and even national nonprofits. Workshops hosted by Courage Speaks taught teenagers how to navigate legal challenges, recognize their rights, and advocate for themselves effectively. The program also provided mentorship opportunities, connecting young participants with lawyers, activists, and educators who served as guides and role models. One of the most impactful initiatives Layla spearheaded was a storytelling project called Voices Unsilenced. Through this platform, young people shared their experiences of encountering bias or injustice, whether in courtrooms, classrooms, or everyday interactions. These stories were compiled into a digital archive accessible to everyone, serving both as a record of systemic issues and a call to action. One participant, a 17-year-old named Jamal, recounted being unfairly targeted by school security officers simply because he wore a hoodie. Another, a girl named Sophia, described feeling dismissed during a custody hearing despite having valid concerns about her safety. Each story added depth and urgency to the movement, reminding listeners that Layla's experience was not unique. It was part of a larger pattern that demanded attention. Layla herself became a prominent voice in the fight for justice reform. She spoke at conferences, appeared on talk shows, and collaborated with artists to create murals, music, and films that highlighted the importance of fairness and accountability. Yet, she never lost sight of why she started this work in the first place. During an interview with a popular podcast host, she said, "I didn't choose this path, it chose me. But if sharing my story can help someone else feel less alone, then it's worth every difficult moment." Marcus, too, found fulfillment in seeing his daughter thrive while continuing his own efforts to drive change at the highest levels of government. His proposed legislation, the Fair Courts Act, had gained bipartisan support after months of negotiation and compromise. The bill mandated comprehensive sensitivity training for all judicial personnel, established independent oversight boards to investigate misconduct claims, and required courts to implement clear protocols for handling cases involving minors. When the act was signed into law, Marcus stood beside Layla at the ceremony, holding back tears as he watched her smile proudly. It was a moment neither of them would ever forget, a tangible reminder that their struggles had led to something meaningful. Beyond policy changes, the cultural shift sparked by Layla's story proved equally significant. Judges across the country began re-evaluating their practices, recognizing the importance of treating everyone who entered their courtrooms with dignity and respect. Law enforcement agencies adopted new de-escalation techniques, emphasizing communication over confrontation. Schools introduced curriculums focused on civics and empathy, teaching students about the value of speaking up against injustice. Even social media played a role, with campaigns like Kiers Respect in Courts encouraging users to share positive examples of fair treatment and hold institutions accountable when they fell short. Of course, the journey wasn't without its challenges. Resistance lingered in certain corners, particularly among those who viewed the reforms as unnecessary or overly intrusive. Some judges complained that the new oversight measures undermined their authority, while others argued that mandatory training programs took time away from their already demanding schedules. Critics occasionally questioned whether Layla's story was representative of widespread issues, dismissing it as an isolated incident blown out of proportion. But Marcus and Layla refused to let negativity derail their progress. Instead, they leaned on the support of allies who believed in their mission. Teachers wrote letters praising the impact of Courage Speaks workshops on their students. Parents thanked Marcus for championing policies that made courthouses safer for their children. Activists celebrated the fact that conversations once considered taboo were now happening openly and honestly. These voices reminded them that change rarely came easily, but it was always worth fighting for. As years went by, the Thompsons' legacy only grew stronger. Layla graduated high school and enrolled in college, where she studied political science and sociology. Determined to deepen her understanding of the system she sought to improve. Her advocacy work earned her prestigious awards, including a humanitarian honor presented by a coalition of civil rights organizations. At the award ceremony, she dedicated her achievement to every young person who has ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. The audience gave her a standing ovation, moved by her humility and conviction. Marcus, meanwhile, retired from his position as U.S. Attorney General, leaving behind a legacy of integrity and compassion. In his farewell address, he reflected on the lessons he'd learned throughout his career, and especially during the tumultuous period following Layla's courtroom ordeal. "Justice is not a destination," he told the crowd gathered to celebrate his tenure. "It's a journey, one that requires constant vigilance and unwavering commitment. And sometimes the greatest strides forward come from the smallest acts of courage." Even in retirement, Marcus remained active in the fight for reform, mentoring young attorneys and advising grassroots organizations on strategy. He often joined Layla at events, the two of them presenting a united front that inspired countless others to join the cause. Together, they proved that the bond between a parent and child could transcend individual circumstances, becoming a force for good that touched lives around the world. Looking back on everything they'd been through, Marcus and Layla agreed that the hardest moments had also been the most transformative. The slap in the courtroom had been devastating, yes, but it had also opened doors to healing, growth, and connection. It had shown them the resilience of the human spirit and the power of turning pain into purpose. Years later, when Layla stood before a packed auditorium to deliver the keynote speech at a national summit on youth empowerment, she paused for a moment, gazing out at the sea of faces watching her. Then, with a smile, she began, "When I was 16, I walked into a courthouse thinking I'd just pay a fine and move on with my life. Instead, I walked out carrying a burden I never expected, but also a gift I couldn't have imagined. The chance to make a difference. Today, I stand here not as a victim, but as a survivor. And I hope my story reminds you that no matter how dark things may seem, there's always light waiting to break through, if we're brave enough to seek it." Her words echoed through the hall, met with thunderous applause. As she stepped down from the stage, Marcus rose from his seat, clapping proudly. For a moment, their eyes met, and they shared a silent understanding. The road ahead would still have obstacles, but together, they had built a foundation strong enough to withstand anything. And with that knowledge, they faced the future, not as individuals but as partners in a lifelong mission to ensure that justice truly belonged to everyone.